On September 14th and 15th, the second phase of the Angela Project was held on the campus of St. Stephen Church in Louisville, Kentucky. The focal topic was the illusion of inclusion, 50 years of downward mobility in Black America.
You have to really talk about where we're going in terms of solutions and what that leadership is going to look like. Now let's have a very honest conversation. I watched Aretha Franklin's funeral, and I saw Reverend Jasper Williams get up there and blame and talk about what we can do as individuals. And I juxtaposed that to Dr. Cosby's eulogy, Muhammad Ali. And when I talk about the kind of leadership that we need to see, we need more Dr. Cosby. We need more people. We have to have more people and more leaders who understand you do not fix a systemic and intentional failure with individual agency.
The illusion of inclusion is how in Black America, the American Black community, we've kind of been given this idea that, well, you're here now, you've arrived, you have 2 legs, 2 feet, you're just like white America, everybody's the same.
They've created the idea that we're all included as though there's opportunity for all. Well, if we're not getting any of the income because the top 1% is taking home 22% of the income and the bottom 50 is only taking home 12% of the income, where is that inclusion supposed to come from?
But we haven't been included in any kind of major way. Integration never really happened. You know, when you look at the zoning laws, we were zoned out of communities, regardless of whether we had jobs, regardless of whether we were teachers or principals or good upstanding people. We were never included. And so that non-inclusion has had consequences in our lives in terms of, that's why we're so far behind in terms of wealth. It's not about whether or not we have a culture. There's nothing wrong with us as Black people that inclusion in terms of the wealth of this country wouldn't fix. And we've never been able to have the opportunity to have that or do that.
And keep in mind, this system of redlining was not done in the public eye. This was done by the federal government and then handed over to private banks. So it was actually a federal policy done for private banks, done for the financial sector. And it's still carried out today. People ask me all the time, does this still happen? And I say, yeah, we call it the real estate market. Everything that redlining was it simply became systematic in what we call today real estate market. If you go to college and take a real estate market analysis class, you are trained how to carry this out.
We began the Angela Project last year as a part of Empower West, our Louisville organization, to help not only our city but our nation begin to have a more serious conversation about race in America, about white privilege in America, about what it's going to take to move the needle. White people like me have been compassionate and interested in Black issues for some time, but it really wasn't until the last 3 years that my eyes have been open and I've been able to see how white privilege that I'm a part of costs the Black community the assets and the resources that they need.
It created a question for me, and that is, who am I now? And who I've decided I am now, and unlike Josh Poe, who said he's not the spokesperson for white people, I am the spokesperson for white people, and so I'd like to introduce myself to you. So I'm calling this a dispatch from the world of white privilege. So I thought I'd begin by giving some of my credentials as a white person, and in case you doubted, I thought I would start out with my Phelps family genealogy, the people named Phelps. My family had a collection of old photos in a shirt box with a rubber band around it. There was only one professional real photograph, and it was in a real frame, so it caught my attention. Here it is. Who's this guy? I asked. And when my parents told me the answer, I turned the picture over and I wrote the words on the back. I wrote, William J. Johnson, circa 1940, 1941, owner of National Erie, later Bucyrus Erie, where my dad worked, where William Phelps worked from 1939 to 1960. And then this line, Mr. Johnson paid for the down payment for William to buy 457 East 35th Street. I've not yet found the deed to that house in Erie, but I have a feeling it will be like the deed that was to the home I live in now here in Louisville, where there was a deed restriction that said this, in between the lines that place restrictions on telephone poles and light poles, and on no sheep or goat or horse or mules, there's this line, this property shall never be sold, rented, or leased, or occupied by any person or persons of African descent. It's white privilege. I didn't know it. I couldn't have named it. It was not apparent in our family. It wasn't part of our story, and that's part of the blindness of white privilege.
So our schools have a lot of challenges, and in fact, there's not the degree of equity, inequality that we would wish for them. The fact of the matter is that schools in poor neighborhoods where, frankly, kids of color live are not as high performing, those children do not have the same opportunities that kids in neighborhoods of more advanced economic status have. So the church must embrace the local school. Public education is a local entity. It is controlled by state governments. Now that's a good opportunity for ministry for churches, and for those churches that are connected to Ethics Daily, to contact that local principal and ask that most powerful question, how can we help? Now, what will happen is when that church gets involved in that local school, that local elementary school, that local middle school, high school, then the pastor and the lay leaders realize the issues that are at work and some of the powerful forces that do not want that local school to succeed, that want to privatize this public trust for personal financial gain. And then the church leader says, wait a minute, we can't let that happen. If that happens, then only children who can pay for an education will receive an education. Only children who are of ethnicities that have the resources in society will receive that education. But that's not the American dream. The American dream is all people are created equal. And the public school has been the cornerstone of American democracy that has advanced that principle. Dr. King called it a promissory note. It is a promissory note, Cliff. We haven't made good on it yet.
Simply put, public education is a provision of God's will and God's justice, what we call God's common good. We've heard that a good bit. For all children. Education is not a commodity to be sold on a market. It is a service that God expects God's people, society, to provide equitably and adequately for all children. Now we got to nail that down before we have any other words about this conversation.
I totally agree with you on your assessment, which is my assessment of the charter schools. I'm not yet convinced that we have the will to do right by black kids.
You cannot fix what you will not face, quoting James Baldwin. So we hope to fix it, to be courageous in our articulation of what took place. So courageous speech, but also courageous ears. And what makes this so powerful is the courageous ears of whites who do not waffle under truth.
I think one thing that does give me hope is the willingness for pastors to have their congregations learn these messages. When I saw pastors, I'm saying particularly white pastors in this case, because this is hard stuff to hear. It's hard to hear stuff that really condemns white privilege and frames white privilege not as an isolation of black failure. And so to have pastors willing to take that on and then try to bring that to a congregation that might not necessarily come to church to hear that, I think that is a great hope.
We need economic democracy. Too few people have too much, and too many have virtually nothing. As we seek to overcome racial separation, class division is now haunting us. You'll bear with me for a minute. It says self-respect and not self-degradation matters. Self-respect must be more important than a dollar. Dignity more important than a dollar.
Martin Luther King Jr. said you have to be careful about optimism. He said because optimism will de-radicalize you. If you think everything's okay, then you're not activated. I'm telling you, it's not okay. Okay? You have to be careful about optimism, and you have to be careful about pessimism. Because if you're overly pessimistic, then you won't fight for change. And each one of those two extremes neutralizes Christian activism.
100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
In 1963, a century after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, America was still divided. Segregation kept blacks and whites in separate worlds that were anything but equal. It would take the loss of life of young and innocent children to shock America into taking a stand for justice. On the morning of September 15th, just as Sunday school classes were ending, dynamite ripped through the 16th Street Church. 5 girls in the basement of the church were buried under 30-inch thick walls, and 4 of them died. The nation was appalled. The need for change was painfully clear. The tide of support for civil rights swelled, flowing into Washington, pushing the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voters Act the following year. It was the innocent hope, bravery, and sacrifice of children that revived a movement and changed the future of a nation.
Join us for the Angela Project, June 19th, 2019, in Birmingham, Alabama, at the historic 16th Street Baptist Church, the site of a great national tragedy for our country, to commemorate the 400th anniversary of American slavery. The Angela Project confronts racism in our current day and age, and is a place for us to speak into as Baptists, as Christians, as those who are concerned about the impact of racial injustice in our country. After Charlottesville, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship penned a statement beginning with these words: "This moment requires more from us as churches and as a nation." As Dr. King reminds us, the great tragedy is not the strident clamor of bad people, but the appalling silence of good people. Silence is not an option. Silence is not Christian. Silence is an affront to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we will not be silent about the ravages of racial injustice now and in the days to come. Join us for the Angela Project, June 19th, 2019. Be there and show up for justice.
You can run this